Great. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us again today. We're really excited to have everybody back. The objective of today is to really jointly discuss and identify some of the gaps in the disaster risk finance evidence space. That will include a readout from the groups yesterday to hear what the groups discussed as the evidence frontier and identified as the gaps for each of the different thematic areas. And then we'll have a conversation together so that people who weren't in the breakout groups can provide feedback on the discussion and add to any gaps that they may see. Then we're thrilled to have Catherine S. Miles here for a presentation on gender and evidence gaps around gender in CDRFI. And then Zunka will lead a discussion around some of the cross-cutting themes in the space and evidence gaps with regards to those themes. So without further ado, I think we can jump right into the readouts from yesterday's session. I think that there are still going to be people joining us over the next several minutes, but we can get started. I think we should just go in order. So I think I saw Lance already here. Lance, if I could ask you if you could share your video. Good to see you. Yeah, unmute yourself too. Lance, you're muted. Can't hear you.
Awesome.
Great, thank you. So this is Mr. Lance Scott from the University of the West Indies, who's going to start the conversation about the discussion in the micro and meso breakout groups from yesterday.
Okay, thank you. So yesterday was a rather interesting discussion. I think it's one of the groups that was, spent the longest, one of the longest breakout session. So we spoke about several different things in regard to agriculture and household level microinsurance and mesoinsurance. One of the things we spoke about was the participants what the participants are working on and aware that could contribute to the evidence landscape. So we realized that you should try to explore what coping response that indigenous communities are using. For example, in Cameroon, we looked at micro insurance working with small enterprises as well, utilizing meteorological index, linking economic activities for payment, and not just on the agricultural side. So under the understanding that you cannot talk about agricultural disasters without looking at the ripple effect outwards to the different micro enterprises and firms within a particular space. They also looked at what seminal works in a rather thematic area, and is the evidence robust. Looked at the different risk technologies that could be put in place, so two of which are the bundling of insurance as well as mobile banking solutions. All right. Furthermore, an important question was asked about what are the questions related to the themes, and we looked at how people shift from more to less expensive forms of risk management, and that is linked directly to the behavior of persons. We looked at what has been the factors that could trigger the public or the government and private insurance providers to work together, because we realized that through several examples that there was not that synergy between the public and private sector along with other stakeholders within the micro and meso insurance sphere. So what are some challenges to get there? Pricing scale sustainability was something raised, and this is in terms of the financial sustainability. So more micro level first and second generation programs are working because of subsidies. And it was mentioned that, you know, probably in about 10 years, these will not be working had it not been for subsidies. So how do you get them to be more sustainable? And the difficulties of making financial meso level programs viable remains an issue, and that's one, you know, we have to find solutions for. It's also difficult to sustain micro level insurance, but not impossible. So maybe it could be a case where we engage other stakeholders other than farmers to make it possible, to make it more sustainable. An important question was, are there gaps in the evidence base that prevent you from being able to move forward in this area? And you know, how are we covering these gaps? Now, some things observed were, you know, business interruption insurance and the index-based products. You know, find out that some of them, their design is in essence flawed, and as such would lead to you know, kind of unsustainability over time. Now, finally, if are there any gaps that most people think are, well, are there gaps that most persons are really thinking about, rather? Why there's need attention? One problem was microinsurance is that it's typically non-scalable for individuals. Returning payment sort of missing out on the opportunity to be scalable, cover individual risk. And is there a way to work on the foundation of a kind of insurance at a government level with technical foundation to allow individuals to scale up their level of protection based on the levels of investment the individual want? So these are some of the gaps that was identified as well in the breakout session.
Thank you, Lance. I appreciate the overview.
I don't know if Tara wants to jump in.
Exactly. I was also going to ask if Tara too from MRR Innovation Lab had anything she wanted to add.
Just very little. I think Lance did a great job of covering it. The two things I would add are actually about Meso, which was the room that joined us, which I loved. So the two things about Meso that I think stood out to me, at least, are that I think thinking about the two different kinds of meso level insurance, whether it's through aggregators or directly through firms, thinking about how the presence of insurance might change their behavior, whether it's economies of scale and being off through aggregation and being able, would that affect the premiums charged as scale is achieved? And then for firms, such as financial institutions, will that change their relationships with farmers and other agriculturalists and other businesses in terms of interest rates or any other kinds of support, depending on the nature of the firm and how they engage with farmers, what kind of behavior changes might come from that kind of protection. And then the last thing about Meso that really jumped out at me is there seems to be a gap between looking at meso level insurance and seeing how the impacts trace down to the indirect beneficiaries. So the people, kind of the individuals under that, how I don't think I think the discussion was mostly that there hasn't been a ton of evidence about how the impacts trace down, and that's another gap.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. Yeah, just to add on to that, I think we were talking about how there has been some push to maybe try to work with the intermediaries because of the difficulties in working with individuals through microinsurance. But yeah, exactly. Then, okay, if you're going to do that, well, where's the evidence that it will have the impacts on those individuals that we were trying to reach originally, but then went through the intermediary in order to reach? So Thanks for that. If anybody else from group 1/2 has anything to add? Great. Well, thank you, Lance and Tara. Really appreciate it. Now I'd like to turn over to Marcella. Can you, I'm not sure if you're doing the readout or if you have a volunteer from the SRP group.
Yeah, our volunteer is Kai. So thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Marcella, and thank you, Jen. Yeah, we had a quite vital discussion on the evidence gaps around sovereign risk pools. And Marcella did a great job on putting together the evidence that we see so far, which is mainly a large OPM evaluation of ARC and the WRI study on the sovereign risk pools by Leonardo last year. And I think there are many gaps in this impacts of risk pools. And we also agreed that, first of all, we need a common ground, which is
Kai, I don't know if this is the case for everybody, but you seem to be cutting in and out. Is your headset well attached?
I hope. Am I like switching on and off?
Yes. It's okay.
Maybe
you sound good right now.
Is it better now?
Yeah, seemingly. We'll
Okay.
see.
I try to keep this straight. Yeah, so we need a common terminology that we work with, and I think the Impact Working Group did a good job on that, and that was part of the discussion. I just wanted to mention, for those of you interested in this terminology, it will be shared with the working group soon. And then the next large part of the discussion was evidence for what? And there are many dimensions of sovereign risk pools and impact dimensions of the risk pools that we could talk about. So, for example, the pools as an instrument itself. So, are they efficient in itself? Because it's a very innovative approach, these mutual insurance ideas. And the next dimension would be which is impacted situations, but also in non-payout situations. And to the impact of that, we would need some more longitudinal panel studies of the financial behavior of governments under risk. And that would also allow to evaluate of the existence of a policy into other areas of financial behaviors of the government. And then finally, it's also about the impacts on the lives of the people, which is maybe a very long way from having a sovereign level insurance to the impacting of resilience. But it's also the most important dimension we're talking about. So that's also a gap that we see very little evidence on so far. And that's why I think in our group we agreed that this is very important. There were also some comments from the group with you. One of them was that the focus on poor and vulnerable people is very important and is key for the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, and also for everybody working under the pro-poor principles. But when evaluating the sovereign risk pools on this target group, might neglect further effects that these pools have, especially with regard to flexibility in response mechanisms that are hopefully designed pro-poor, but not only pro-poor, and sometimes also designed to benefit the entire population. And that also needs to be subject to the evaluations. And another interesting point that we discussed was that some of the pools, they also combine macro level insurance with micro and meso payout mechanisms. And if we evaluate the macro solution in silos, these impacts that these mechanism combinations might have. And that's also a gap that we identified.
Great, thank you, Kai. Thanks for that readout. It's really interesting. Marcella, did you have anything you wanted to add? I see you.
Reading the minutes, probably.
Yeah, I was actually I was reading the minutes. I thank you. We had a very rich discussion, so I think it's hard to honor and to say everything. So, but what was very good is that we got very good notes, and Jonathan from the center, he kindly also shared with Kai and with myself a summary of points. So we will be, you were copied on that email on part of it, but I think it's important that we share with you, Jen, and with Sonke, the full discussion, and I guess the summary that Jonathan has prepared. And that's perhaps it. Yeah, we cannot honor all the discussion, which was very rich and with very different opinions. So
that's great. Well, excellent to hear. And yeah, we look forward to taking both advantage of this readout and further notes for the purposes of the roadmap. So thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, great. So then if we turn to the third group, I believe that Zunka is doing the readout for the macro policy solutions group.
God volunteer. No, we missed to actually find a volunteer in time, so I'll do it. It was a good group. I think we went on for like 2 hours, more or less, and we had perspectives from specifically from Asia and Africa around the table. Also government representatives. I think it's important to have that perspectives, that user perspective of evidence. So just to highlight a few key challenges, and of course I would also ask my colleagues that were also part of the group to join in if I'm missing anything, but I have to pull out the notes at the same time. So, so one key challenge was raised around how these type of approaches, and we're talking about national level macro policy approaches, how do they also reach the most vulnerable as one of the evidence gaps, and also specifically how they work with the informal sector was raised as an evidence gap. It was noted that for governments to take action on this and the willingness of governments to engage in the dialogue around these type of instruments, it is also important to have success stories and the kind of longitudinal aspect. I think it was already mentioned in the group before, and also comparative aspects around collecting the experiences that different countries did could be characterized as an evidence gap. Moreover, also specifically on how to create public-private partnerships, how to deal with different actors, including the private sector. That was something which was raised by also the government representatives. Then we have also, I think this is a big gap, which was very obvious in the discussions, is the climate information and generally information and data gap when it comes to risk information. So some of the underlying, for example, risk models, they don't necessarily cover all countries to the same extent. There are also barriers between different actors within government when it comes to data exchange that is actually relevant to operationalize some of these approaches. And people were also saying that there are, in some cases, even the methods are missing to fully judge specifically also the fiscal impact on different approaches, and also on, say, non-action, and to compare that over time. So that was raised as one of the gaps. In relation to the evidence agenda, and also what should be highlighted as kind of collective action, people said that one should also acknowledge there are indigenous, also academic capacities within these countries. For example, in India, also universities that work on this, but still that there's a silo thinking present, and that more cooperation is necessary. And then on one of the, I don't have it as a key challenge, but one of the, we called it also an evidence gap. So maybe it's a bit conflictive information to what we just heard before, but this kind of link between different instruments, and specifically also the regional risk pools and how they link to macro policy solutions. There's also not a lot of evidence on how this can be operationalized, and also what its performance is, and things like that. So this was also specifically highlighted as one of the gaps, but it might be that there were different perspectives in the other group that actually say otherwise. Is there anything I missed, dear group? Then please pitch in.
Yes, thank you very much. I think you covered most of the important points. I think we talked a lot about the importance or the potential of public-private partnerships, and also about funding, the effectiveness of public insurance scheme, and that the willingness of governments to engage in this depends a lot on their access to finance and to data. And that there are different solutions that have been tried to finance these schemes, and there's little comparison of the effectiveness of different public insurance schemes. And I think, Sönke, you also mentioned that there's also no real cross-referencing between schemes in developed and developing countries. It might be interesting to compare those as well in certain ways. And under the data gaps, I think what we also talked a lot about is a lack of household level data, about the willingness and ability of households and different populations to pay premiums, about different vulnerability and capacity characteristics of them, and the different risk layering and different capacities on a household level. There's very little data on that. And I think most of the others, everything else you already said. Academia was also definitely, we talked about this a lot, because there are also definitely academic institutions that already have mechanisms that connect to vulnerable populations for research purposes and for training purposes. And this might be something we could utilize, also governments could utilize to fill data gaps, and also to connect and build awareness among those that need insurance protection. So I think just a few points I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Thank you, Sönke. If there's nothing else from group 4, I think I'm turning over to Simon for the non-insurance CDRF discussion.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you. I'm going to report back from the breakout group number 5, which was on non-insurance CDRF, and by that we meant household savings, credit, remittances, and also forecast-based finance. So we started out with a summary of literature, which was very nicely done by Ruth Hill. She summarized some very interesting points on the existing literature. And she stated that there's not much evidence that savings can be helpful to address large and covariate shocks. So it would still be interesting to research on this, but it's important to consider that theory suggests that savings are not the optimal solution for these kinds of large shocks that we usually work on. Also, there's emerging evidence on contingent credit, that it can be helpful, but the evidence base still needs more experimentation and also evaluation. And similar private transfers of money, like remittances, for example, it seems especially interesting here how they can be used and which broader implications they have for development. And in general, it can be said that for household instruments, from a perspective of risk layering, all of them will be needed and will have a place in theory, but there needs to be more effort towards comparing different instruments or even combinations of different instruments. Yeah, with regards to forecast-based finance, the literature can say the following, that it's relatively new and it's a strong area of experimentation, and it has successful pilots. Ruth mentioned, for example, as the pilot in Bangladesh on floods, and also that most of the early impacts of forecast-based financing are modeled and they're not published in peer-reviewed journals. But there's now a positive and plausible peer-reviewed publication on the pilot in Bangladesh. So that's something she pointed out. And on top of that, it would be valuable to replicate the work that has been done on forecast-based financing, and to have also more experimental work, or to explore also other directions of this. Yeah, and in addition to that, in our discussion, it was confirmed that there's more research needed in the area of non-insurance DRF, and that the assessments that have been made so far differ very much in terms of scientific rigor. So for example, academic research compared to other research or assessments that were done by different organizations, including the private sector or implementing institutions. And yeah, also the research that was done by the private sector or implementing institutions could especially be impactful if it enables them to make different types of contingency loans available in a meaningful way. Additionally, it was mentioned that bringing together efforts of research and private or implementing institutions can achieve a more holistic view of what is actually happening on the ground. And it was stated that while the private or implementing institutions usually might lack the capacity, the resources, or even the time to capture the evidence, researchers are better able to focus on a case more in depth. So having more exchange between research and the private or implementing institutions could lead to fruitful exchanges on what was working, what was not working, and especially why was it working or why was it not working. And another important aspect mentioned in the discussion was that a cohesive narrative or terminology on the various tools is needed, and that efforts need to be made on how we can move forward now effectively. And finally, Sandra Ferguson also mentioned the importance of including religious actors into this terminology and into the considerations. So she mentioned an example of a well-functioning scheme of the Adventist Church that she knows from her work in Grenada. Yeah, the next question was on the open questions around non-insurance DRF. And we just compiled a few. First of all, it was what was working, what was not working, and why, in case an instrument has failed, for example. What would be an effective non-insurance tool in the case of large shocks? So we discussed savings before. Literature points towards them not being the optimal solution. So which tool can be effective in those large covariate shocks? And also, what can we learn from religious actors, such as the Adventist Church scheme? What are long-term effects of non-insurance DRF? And that was seen as probably the most important question in our discussion. And it was said that we are lacking evidence to convince people that are in charge of funding approval. There is no lack of knowledge on how to do it, but we are lacking evidence that it's working or not working. So, yeah. And then also, to what extent do savings actually have the capacity to help households? Speaking of large-scale shocks. and what would be the effect of different savings products. For instance, savings usage after shock, we need to see how the products work together and how effective they are. And therefore it was said that we have to think the insurance side and the savings side together. Or yeah, what instrument is suitable for each specific situation and what is affecting the effectiveness of instruments of DRF. And finally, about the credit, yeah, we discussed that mostly credit is issued to households that have been approved by the issuing institution. So we asked ourselves, aren't those mechanisms leaving out people who need the most? Yeah, and then with regards to who is actively working on answering those questions, Simon Hagemann mentioned that the Global Risk Financing Facility is trying to learn lessons from each country and their respective products. And he was asking what the advice could be for the focal point working on this, and what could be the most important element for going forward. And he was reflecting on if they should focus on specific cases more in depth, or if they should keep it broader to more areas and to general lessons learned. So that's an open question he raised. Yeah, I also mentioned from my own PhD research that I'm currently working on an overview on different existing risk transfer solutions that are present in my research area, which is in a transboundary river basin in Togo and Benin in West Africa. And I'm looking at both informal and formal risk transfer options. And I'm trying to see how they are available to people, and also how they help them to recover financially from the impacts of flood events. And I want to study that in a household survey whenever when I can do fieldwork again, of course. Yeah, and lastly, the gaps that need to be addressed and the potential challenges around methodology. We concluded that cooperation between academia, implementing organizations, and the private sector is important. And in order to get a full picture of what is working and what is not working, it is necessary to capture more experiences so that we don't have a biased view of only hearing about success stories, and that there's missing information of failed cases. And that does not only apply to implementing organizations or the private sector, but also to academic researchers, since they find it difficult to publish papers where there's no significant effect of those instruments. Yeah, so so both implementing organizations and the private sector have reasons to not share failed cases, just as in academia as well. And the international community needs to work together to bring this knowledge to a common platform, so that the same mistakes are not made again, and others can learn to improve upon previous approaches. And then finally, more research needs to be done on how the usage of those non-insurance DRF instruments differ based on gender, and especially given that both savings and credit can be community-based. And more research should be done looking at how the difference between men and women's networks in the communities affect their access to and the usage of those non-insurance instruments. But also it's important to reflect on how to capture the differences methodologically. Yeah, okay, so that's for the notes from our session. Anyone from our group can add in if I missed on some aspects. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I appreciate it. Anybody else from Group 5? So I just wanted to, so first, thank you to all of the moderators. Thank you to all of the note takers and volunteers for the readout. we really appreciate this, and it was great to bring this all back to plenary today. I just wanted to remind everyone that, of course, these haven't been fully comprehensive discussions. We haven't had all of the authors of all of the papers and all of the practitioners and local organizations involved in these different initiatives available to join in these conversations. But I think it's still really nice to get, you know, a taste of the different conversations from the different groups, and that will help us as we think about how we should move forward collectively to increase the evidence in this space. One other thing I'll note before opening it up for just general comments and feedback is that one thing I think is really interesting is there were a lot of similarities actually in a lot of the things that were mentioned in the readout. For example, the macro group and the non-insurance group were things that we also discussed in the micro and meso group. So I think, you know, the importance and difficulties around public-private partnerships, you know, challenges around household needs, vulnerabilities, and data. You know, these are things, linkages between the non-insurance financial services and the insurance financial services. These are things that seem to have come up in a lot of different groups. So it's really interesting to see some of those challenges and gaps that kind of cut across the different thematic areas. So we have a few minutes to perhaps open it up, see if people have things that they want to add, perhaps if they weren't in one of the breakouts, things that they want to suggest is gaps or feedback, general discussion on the different thematic areas. So, okay, I saw some hand waving from your end a couple minutes ago.
Well, it's not a very big evidence gap, but when I heard the report back from the regional risk insurance pools, I was wondering if there's actually evidence on the behavior of the governments in purchasing this insurance, because some of these governments are actually very similar in terms of the risk profile, but I know that they actually can take out and it's a good thing. It's demand driven. They can take out policies based on, for example, they can differ in terms of attachment points and things like that. But what you would expect is actually that like similar countries would take out similar policies. And I think it's actually not the case. And I was just wondering if you reflected that in your group, and I think it's actually the question on behaviors of countries. But yeah, that was my head shaking. I was wondering that, but it's a smaller question actually.
Yeah, it was part of the discussion, but maybe not exactly what I meant. I think the gap that we talked about also included the change in behavior when a government has bought insurance coverage. So even in a non-payout situation, how does their financial planning also in other sectors change, like or planning with or like the whole package. But I mean, the point that you raised is also very interesting.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, comments, discussion points from the readout? Okay, great. Well then, thank you to everybody again for providing that readout, and we look forward to taking those points and moving them forward with the evidence roadmap. Now I'd like to pass over to Catherine S. Miles, who is author of the Integrating Gender Considerations into Different Models of Climate Risk Insurance, with a co-author, which was written for the Insure Resilience Global Partnership, I believe. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, hopefully you can hear me okay. Is that all working well? Good. And
Yes.
hopefully the slides are on the screen as well, and these can be shared with you all afterwards. So I've been asked to just speak to you for about 10 minutes or so, just to provide some insights around what I think some of the gaps are in the current evidence landscape related to gender and CDRFI. Now, these insights are based on the two studies that I co-authored with Martina on behalf of the Insure Resilience Global Partnership. The first in 2018, which was really looking at the business case. That was looking at the relationship between gender and disaster risk financing and insurance, and it was looking at what schemes incorporate gender considerations. The second, which was published at the end of last year, was the case for integrating gender into these different types of schemes and provider types. And so I'm going to sort of provide a bit of the evidence that we found exists, as well as where we found some gaps, because I think it's necessary to sort of show that in order to understand where we think some of these gaps are. I think some of the themes that I've just heard you mention based on the breakout groups in those readouts just now sort of also reflect some of what we've found within this research. So in terms of some of the evidence that is there, and I think many of you on the call hopefully will be familiar with some of this, is around there is actually a business case around why focus on women and integrate gender into CDRFI. And some of this is built up from a range of different data sets, so it's sort of pieced together from different sources. But where I think some of the case is very well summarised is the UNFCCC synthesis report last year, which acknowledged much of this around sort of the case around how climate change and disasters generally hit women harder, and that there are gender differential impacts, greater vulnerabilities based on sort of social norms context, for instance, for women than men in certain contexts. And this is in the wider context of sort of evidence around lower levels of formal financial inclusion for women, gender differences in financial risks, needs and constraints, but also what works in terms of enabling financial access and usage of women compared to men in different segments. There is also evidence around disasters and violence against women and girls, and actually we'll come to the COVID situation shortly, but some of that has basically resurfaced in the context of the lockdowns and COVID, as has this issue around the impact of disasters on women's unpaid care burden. And so essentially sort of there's a body of evidence which you do have to draw from different sources, which really makes the case for why you should focus on women or gender considerations within CDRFI. If you then look at insurance instruments specifically, there is some evidence that exists around this business case, and this is not specific to climate risk insurance at macro, meso and micro level, but it's more insurance in general, and micro insurance specifically, and at different parts of the business model, and how women and men can be differentially impacted by and engaged in different models of insurance. And that evidence is applicable for climate risk insurance, but has not necessarily been generated through studies on climate risk insurance schemes specifically. So again, it's about pulling together the evidence that exists from other areas and using it to make the case in the CDRFI space, as opposed to it being generated within this field. A few things that I'd like to just point out with regard to insurance, and I know that there's some individuals on the call today who have a lot of expertise in this area, so probably not new for some of you. But one is the IMF have some research out there which says if there's a higher share of women on boards of banking supervision agencies, that's associated with greater bank stability. And so whilst that's not specific to insurance supervisors, it can be applied potentially within that context, and therefore within the policy context of some of these CDRFI schemes may be relevant to draw on. There's also the whole data set around gender diversity of boards related to company governance, profitability, financial performance and innovation, which again, not specific necessarily to the insurance industry and therefore CDRFI, but it can also be applied here too. And then evidence sets around employee gender diversity, improving product design, solution design, not just of insurance, but of other products as well, so you can better serve the women's market, then and gain through greater gender diversity in distribution models, sort of greater reach to female clients. That there's evidence out there. Again, it's sort of some of it is in the insurance sector. It's not specific to CDRFI, but could be applied in this context, and so it's there in showing that there is evidence that exists, but there are gaps at the same time because it's not specifically linked to these specific instruments. Turning to where there are documented gender approaches. So again, this is sort of two sides of the same coin in some aspects. There are not that many documented examples of gendered approaches to CDRFI. Part of the work that Martina and I worked on with Insurer Resilience and these two studies was to actually document some of these approaches. And so we did say for some at the macro level, drawing on some information that was generally available, but a lot of it was stuff that we pieced together through interviews ourselves. And so there are documented examples. They do exist now, in part through some of the work that we've done, but they're sort of piecemeal examples of where these approaches exist. I'm sure that more work could be done to further document other gender approaches that maybe we're not aware of in CDRFI schemes. Again, at the micro level, there are examples that exist here, just a few on the screen, and the different ways in which gender considerations have been built into these CDRFI models, but at the same time, this is about the practice, and it's not actually focusing on what we're really wanting to know is, do these different approaches actually work? And this is where we then come to the fact that quite large evidence remain within this this area. Even at the very specific practice level, what we're seeing is if sex disaggregated data is collected, and we've managed to identify examples of where it is, it's not often analysed, and it's not being used to inform product design necessarily, or understand customer journeys and how women and men's journeys, say through using micro level climate risk insurance, for instance, is different from each other. There is also not really a life cycle approach, sort of what the needs are for these products at different times of individuals' life cycles, and for different economic segments as well. There are data gaps also, even at the very descriptive level of understanding of these different schemes that exist. What is the level of women's participation versus men's participation in the leadership and workforce? And that's what you need sometimes to build that sort of business case that is really specific to CDRFI. And that's why we're having to, at the moment, draw on business case data from sort of the wider financial sector in many instances. In terms of some of the good practice evidence there and data, as I've mentioned, so there's some examples now of gender-related practices, but we don't necessarily know what is working and what isn't working to increase women's access and usage of these instruments, and specifically to address their different protection needs, for instance. And there's also a lack of research of one very particular area, which has again significantly come to the fore with the COVID situation, which is the gendered impact of natures on women's unpaid care burden, but also violence against women. So how can these different financing mechanisms somehow alleviate these negative impacts on women in these ways? And that's particularly relevant potentially for the macro level schemes. And then another area we found that there seems to be a gap on is to the extent to which gender considerations and also sex disaggregated data is being used in risk modelling and is present in existing disaster databases, and how that can then be used to create vulnerability maps. Yeah, there are plenty of gaps there that we've identified. One particular gap though that I want to draw your attention to, which I think is really the crux of the matter, which is around what we want these mechanisms to actually have a positive impact on individuals, and that also relates to ensuring that there are not negative gender impacts that result from payouts, and that it doesn't reduce levels of women's empowerment. In fact, hopefully it would contribute to that. So there is a need for further research in the area, or research full stop, on how these different payouts have addressed different gender specific or gender differential needs and impacts of these disasters. One example where there has been some evidence is around the R4 Rural Resilience Initiative, both in Senegal and I think Ethiopia as well, where some very specific findings have come out of that, which show how it's impacted women's empowerment positively, and also influence women's decision making. And that's the sort of level of and the type of evidence I think that we would be looking for from some of these schemes. And also to the point that was mentioned earlier around this issue of indirect beneficiaries, what Martina and I found through some of the research that we conducted was that quite often in macro schemes there wasn't that thinking, or even at the meso level as well, as what is that impact going to be on women and men as individuals, because they're not the direct recipients of payouts, but they can be impacted through those payouts positively and negative, and that can have an impact on gender dynamics in the society at large. And one example of that could be at a macro level, where if you choose to prioritise payouts to a particular economic sector, and if women disproportionately do or don't work within that sector, that is going to then, and because there are very specific gender differences in economic participation with women and men in many countries and sectors around the world, that then can have an influence on what the impact of that payout is going to be on them at an individual level. So it'd be great to sort of find out more about that. Want to just, as we start drawing to a close, just mention around this issue of gender and risk modelling gaps. The Insurance Development Forum have been conducting a study around the development impact of risk analytics, and for that I did some research which was exploring at a greater level sort of how gender and sex disaggregated data was being used within climate and disaster risk analytics, but there's certainly a lot more work that needs to be done there. So it seems that there's very limited integration of this data, but actually, and this sort of vulnerability information, but really more research is needed to understand how it is being integrated at the moment, and whether that is then having an impact, a positive impact around sort of gender differential impacts of disasters. And so, you know, it seems that this data is not currently being integrated into either public or private sector catastrophe risk modelling as a matter of course. And so yeah, it would be useful for that to not only be done, but also research to be done on that to understand what the impact of that is. And to the point that I mentioned earlier around the connection with COVID, what I think that this has specifically shown is some lessons around research gaps, particularly related to the design and implementation of sovereign catastrophe risk pools. And because what we have seen is women, the different levels of women's involvement in these in the disaster risk reduction plans and in the planning and implementations of priorities around that. But there needs to be sort of research around, you know, the extent to which women have been involved, how that has then impacted decisions that are made in that planning and in the implementation of the payout priorities, and specifically around how these payouts can address gender-based violence and how it can address issues related to rebuilding of childcare infrastructure. And as we have seen with COVID, it has really had an impact disproportionately on women, where lockdowns have closed schools and meant that quite often women are the ones that are then having to take over the childcare, and as a result of that are not available for economic participation anymore, and they've been the ones that have been losing their jobs as a consequence. So applying that in sort of some of these disaster risk context, I think more broadly would be useful, and understanding what works and what doesn't around that. And finally, some research is needed around gender-specific barriers to access to emergency payouts as well. Again, there could be some evidence that is drawn on from general social protection research that is done, but it would be useful to apply this in the CDRFI area as well. So just to summarise, you know, there is evidence on sort of why to do this, and it's very focused around descriptive data that exists that you can kind of piece together. But actually what we need, and where there are gaps, is what's actually working to better integrate gender considerations into CDRFI, and also to ensure that the impacts of this financing is positive and contributes to gender equality and women's empowerment, as well as to address the climate and disaster risks faced by vulnerable women and men individuals. So I'll leave that there, and if you've got any questions, happy to speak.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. That was an excellent overview. Really appreciate it. I guess I know that we will be touching on gender as a cross-cutting theme and general evidence gap. So I guess maybe first we'll just take any specific questions about the content of the presentation, if anybody has any for Catherine.
You can always follow up, and I definitely recommend just have a look at the publications. A lot of the information is there, and the IDF publication will be coming out very soon as well. I'm sure that will be circulated by Ensure Resilience, as they're involved in the development of that.
Great, thank you. And just so everybody knows, we have already posted Catherine's presentation to our webpage. So you can find it there, and also take advantage of the links that were directly in the document. So thank you. I think you can stop sharing now. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so as a segue then, I'll pass over to Zunka to just start getting us discussing some of the cross-cutting evidence gaps with regards to CDRFI.
Yeah, thank you, Jen, for handling the first half of the session. So when we were designing it, we were actually thinking that after this kind of thematic exploration through the 5 breakout groups, that we should also identify some of the overarching themes that should be highlighted in this, what at the end of the day will also be a call for action in one way or the other. So this today we really want to look at some of the overarching and cross-cutting issues. So maybe the first thing, and we will hope to do that through a plenary discussion. So we have like something like 45 minutes maybe to do it. And we already anticipated that gender really would be one of the themes that are relevant to all breakout groups. So I would suggest that we have actually also a discussion on what it means for the evidence base specifically, and also what you, in your capacity or in your view, would suggest to take out from the presentation that we just heard before, and which really should also go into this strategic document. So we would say we would focus maybe 15 or 20 minutes on that, but we should also discuss other elements. My proposal would actually be to look at two specifically, but I'm also happy to change that. So if there are any perspectives, please come forward. And the proposal would be that we, on one hand, maybe deconstruct the question of quality. I think it has been raised during the discussion for, several times. It's also part of the pro principles. So this could be something we pull out specifically. And then the second subject would be, or the third subject indeed, would be resilience impact or resilience. And I mean, it's obvious that specifically the type of approaches that are implemented, they really should also contribute to a resilience impact at the end of the day. So I would suggest that this is our third topic that we can tackle during the plenary discussion. Are there any views or any perspectives on putting it into this framework of talking about gender first, then quality, and then resilience? I don't see anyone. Okay, good. So then, yeah, maybe taking or listening to Catherine on the gender presentation, and also some of the gaps when it comes to the operational programs, but also when it comes to the state of knowledge. Are there any perspectives, and people, please move forward, break the ice, including yourself, Catherine. Are there any perspectives of what you really think are some of the crunch issues that should be highlighted, that are relevant to different instruments? Speaking of, say, microinsurance approaches, speaking of the risk pools, what are some of the big things you would want to see come out of an evidence roadmap, which should be really highlighted in a strategic document?
Maybe just to kick off, one thing that I didn't go into the level of detail on is around sort of the affordability, gender differences in affordability of micro level CDRFI for women. But I think that has come up. I think it was ACRE that have done started to do some research about that in East Africa, and they were working with a Canadian organisation, I believe, to conduct a gender analysis on the affordability of products. But I think that looking at the affordability side would be an important aspect to include.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think this is a helpful comment. Maybe if it's difficult for people to get started on what you would like to see directly in the evidence roadmap, it's also from your perspective, because we do have, say, providers of evidence with us, but we also have users of evidence with us. So if there are people that actually work on some of the instruments, what are some of the gender relevant questions that you have that you would want to see answering and which also would help you to move forward?
So we might be more a collector of evidence in the Secretariat, but something that I would be very keen to see would be an investigation of the payout mechanisms and of gender equality perspectives in payout mechanisms. Because when we collect numbers as we do now, we mainly just take the number of policies, for example, in micro solutions and multiply them by the number of people in the households, and that doesn't have any information on gender equality, and we just take it for granted that benefits from a payout. But I think we are all aware that this is not the case, at least not everywhere, and this would be a super interesting evidence piece. And maybe in line with that, also linked to payouts is the non-payout situation under having an insurance policy in a. So how does the financial behavior change? How do intra-household bargaining mechanisms change under having an insurance policy for climate risks? That was for behavioral economists, that would be very interesting to see.
Okay, thank you very much. And obviously, if there are responses to these ideas, if you endorse them, please come forward. Also, in terms of, we do have a chat function, so you can use that for some sort of three-dimensional type of communication. It's also possible, and it was also if there are reactions. So.
Just on the payout point, I mean, what I think we had from some of the stakeholder consultations we had was that actually, even if a policy is in a woman's name, she's not actually receiving the payout, because if it goes to a mobile phone and she has used her husband's mobile phone number as the registered number for her policy, then they actually are the ones that receive then the payout and use it. So even if there's a payout, has the person actually received the payout to which it was intended, as well as what impact it has had on their lives?
Okay, thank you. Are there any other perspectives?
Yeah, this is Simon from Washington. Hi, Zanke. I think we're currently working on a study on CDRFI and gender in the Pacific, and so we as World Bank, and what we find quite difficult actually is or what we would find most useful probably is to look more into product design of insurance policies for women. We feel like there's not so much, at least in the Pacific. But I think it would be a really good field going forward. And then by that, I think we mean, yeah, for sure you can look at the macro, but there's obviously not so much macro, but also really looking at the household insurance, ag insurance, this kind of stuff. This would be definitely a field we'd be interested to explore a little bit more in the future.
This is Jen. Yeah, just to second that, I think what I was thinking is perhaps it would be helpful to have more evidence around the gendered aspects of needs with regards to disaster risk finance, because it's one thing to, think about how is this product affecting women and men, but it's different to think about the design, as Simon says, how can we design a product that meets the needs of this population, and when this population is predominantly women, those needs may differ. So yeah, I would second that and just add the specific bit about needs.
Hi, Jen. I would add on to that and just build off of that. I think this is an area I'm really curious about learning more about, building off of that, which is there's a tendency in some places to think about certain crops or livelihoods as men's or women's, when we realize that the research is showing that if a disaster impacts a men's activities such as livestock, it doesn't just affect the men. There's this intra-household kind of dynamic where the risk burden is shared or disproportionately pushed onto women. So thinking about not just those impacts directly, but also in terms of trying to increase access and distribution, how we talk about it, including in our marketing and education tools to make that conversation. Yes, we're selling livestock insurance, but women, this is why it matters for you. This is why it's a bigger picture thing. And this is some work that at UC Davis at the MRR lab, we're just starting to look into in a very specific context in very specific places, but I think it's a much bigger question to dive into than what we're currently looking at.
Okay.
On similar lines, I think in the conversation yesterday in our group, we had someone from Africa speaking about how there are a lot of saving schemes for women and if insurance can be integrated through these saving schemes. And I think this is what also came out from the non-DRFI session readout that I heard. Along with savings and credit, insurance can be included. So I think we really need to think through which channels can we access more females, and those distribution channel or access channels should be open for such risk financing instruments.
Okay, thank you, Shady. Yeah, I think these are valuable contributions. Also, just to say, there are like 2 comments in the chat box, and especially the second one, I think it's also something where I would invite further perspectives. The question is around, I think it is also around the vulnerability aspect of gender and also other forms of vulnerability, and how this should be reflected in a strategic evidence roadmap moving forward. I think this, I would ask people to react to that. Also saying that we are focusing a little bit on the household level instruments in the discussions. And I remember also in our group, we actually discussed it briefly on macro policy solution. We discussed briefly the gender aspect. So if there were any discussions in your respective groups yesterday that you, and you can also share that with a bigger group, then this would be most helpful. Are there any reactions, further perspectives, and also reactions to the questions posted in the chat?
If I could just add on to your last comment about looking at the different levels of insurance, I think that's one of the questions, again, we've started kind of thinking about, but more evidence is needed in terms of the meso level insurance. Again, there was discussion about aggregation versus towards firms, but I'm also interested in how it differentially engages women. For example, if you are insuring a financial institution in terms of women's demand for credit and approval rates for women and things like that. So the firm behavior as it relates to gender in the presence of a meso level scheme, I think is also a interesting area for further research.
Yeah, and this was not part of our discussion in the sovereign risk pools group, but what we could think of as an investigation on that level is that a lot of crisis response money is going into the reconstruction, and it would be interesting to investigate which kind of gender differentials are there in the need for the use of critical infrastructure, and whether the fund distribution into the reconstruction of these infrastructure parts meets these needs.
Yeah, I would just second that particular point, because I think with the infrastructure, I think there's been some work done. It's very much a separate body of work around how women and men use transportation infrastructure differently. and in terms of considerations around safety, where the stops are, times of day, various other aspects. And I don't think this is necessarily being applied to the discussions around payout priorities for reconstruction of infrastructure after a disaster.
This is Jen. If I could just pick up the comment on disability. I think that this is something that we haven't discussed, to my knowledge, at all so far in the workshop, and it's a great point. I agree that we should be more systematic about looking at various different types of vulnerabilities, but we do know that, I mean, I think there is evidence, from example, from the Sri Lankan tsunamis, perhaps it was, that people living with disabilities were much more affected than other individuals, and you know, thinking about both probably adaptive social protection systems, but also different needs of people living with disabilities is something that we should probably think about more strategically.
Okay, thank you. Are there any missing pieces from the working groups yesterday? Otherwise, I would also ask those people that basically represent, for example, some implementing agencies in this space to maybe prepare some prepare your thinking around some, what is important to you in terms of gender, and where some of the evidence gaps in the space. So are there any further perspectives?
One thing I'd just add, I mean, Catherine already mentioned in her presentation, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. I mean, and she also made the tie into COVID, although not specifically with regards to that, although we have seen with COVID specifically, much higher rates of domestic violence. And so I think that, I know that we don't often think about things like intimate partner and domestic violence when we are designing products, but you know, it is an important consideration, particularly, you know, MCII is working in the Pacific. Simon just mentioned the Pacific. The Pacific is a region that still has very high rates of intimate partner violence. So I think it is something that we should think about, particularly, you know, how does finance intersect with those pre-existing issues and vulnerabilities?
So maybe just to elaborate on that point, I think with respect to the COVID situation, which has really brought it a bit more prominently to the fore, is that with this, there's a real role for the macro schemes, because things such as like women's shelters and support to those organisations that work with victims of domestic violence seem to not be generally receiving the level of financial support generally that they need to support the level of demand that they receive, both in normal times, but when that's exceeded to the time of a disaster, it just highlights the need for them to be receiving even greater financial resources as an immediate payout priority. And that, to the extent to which that is then built into the disaster risk plans, as well as then the payout priorities, is an area of research, I think, that could really be looked at, and the actual financial cost that's put in, and how has that made a material difference after a disaster. And so some more longitudinal data would be useful on that as well, to highlight how important that is.
Okay, good. I think if there are no other perspectives at this point, I think it's a perfect segue actually to the next session or the next topic, which would be quality. So the first question is, of course, what do we mean by quality, and what does it mean to individual actors. Probably we have to think about it from different perspectives. One is quality of the product in itself, and we already heard from some of the breakout groups that there are also questions around that. For example, is it a sustainable product over long over time? Is there a business case if I talk about an insurance product? But I think it's also broader. Does it meet the needs of the people in terms of quality? Things like that. So I would ask you maybe to think about quality. What are some of the evidence gaps when it comes to quality of different instruments? Yeah. So are there any? Is there anyone, any brave soul that wants to break the ice and move forward?
I'll quickly jump in. We've been doing a lot of work looking at quality product design, mostly at the micro level, but I do think that there are lessons learned that we can then kind of move upward to meso and sovereign risk layers. But I think an important point to think about and how to respond to that is quality in terms of product design, particularly for the parametric-based products. Thinking about how if there's poor quality design of the product in terms of the index itself or the way the contract is structured with pricing, et cetera, there's actually a chance that you're introducing more risk into a situation rather than removing risk. If there's a high probability of, you know, false positive readings or false negative readings, it can dramatically affect pricing. It can actually be taking money out of people's pockets and then failing them. In particular, if having insurance actually creates the investment that we would like to see in good years, you have the confidence of having a product and you take out loans, you invest more, and then the product fails you, you're worse off perhaps than if you had had no insurance at all. So thinking about how we can keep that eye on quality in such a way that we're making sure that we're actually effectively transferring the risk rather than introducing more risk into the situation and actually doing more harm than good.
Okay, thank you. Almost a framing intervention. Are there any reactions, further perspectives?
Hi, this is Shelly again. With Tara on that point with related to data index and also in the affordable out that they should be sustainable. What I think is like insurance is a solution that works for the developed countries. Insurance is designed. Life is different, non-life is different. But when we go to a developing country context, people who are using financial instruments for the first time should be innovated. It should be one instrument for them and not break it out into silos that either you buy this or you buy that because they have a limited amount of money. The next point I would say is that insurance is designed in such a manner that mostly these CDRFI instruments are for 1 year. And if you don't get a payout, your money is wasted. While when we design it, we know that the insurance payouts will be from 3 to 5 years time frame.
Shelley, you're breaking up.
Okay, I'm sorry, my connection is poor here. That's why I've already, but I think it's still poor. So my point is with respect to the duration of the time frame of the contract, because that is how we design the product and not for a 1 year solution. They should not expect that payout. And I think they a lot of issues with financial literacy. So I think we need to innovate the financial instrument itself when we go to who doesn't understand and who can't afford it.
If I could add on to Shirley's point about the 1 year products, I mean, and Tara may have more information on this than I do, but I mean, I recall situations where there were 1 year drought products being developed. I think it was in Malawi, and people would buy a 1 year drought product that wouldn't get a payout. And then when there was an El Nino year and there was expected to be a drought, all of a sudden the drought product wasn't available on the market anymore. So people had been buying it in years when there was very little chance of a payout, and the year that they would have gotten a payout, the product wasn't sold. So I think that's another reason to look at the time horizon with these products.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm realizing it's a bit of a closed group, and we have also the black screen syndrome. Anyways, this is fine. Are there any other perspectives and views on the topic? I think we should maybe spend another 10 minutes or so on quality, and also the question on what does quality actually mean. Quality for the provider, we are talking about the provider of a solution, is a different perspective than, say, the user of a solution. And I think, for example, for a commissioning body that actually does project implementation on this topic, it's more like the user perspective where it should matter. So with that, yes, who wants to talk next? And you can also please raise hand function, or you can make funny faces in your camera, or just not, that's fine. We have first William maybe, and then Tara.
All right. Let me just talk a little bit on quality. I think we, most of the time when we are dealing with people from rural areas, since microinsurance has to deal with numbers, when the quality is compromised, it will also affect the demand and the number. So I think my suggestion is on quality, the provider of the service has to go, in fact, if they have designed an insurance product, it has to go in various phases, which should not only focus on those people, for instance, who are in urban, but it should be favorable also to the people from the rural areas, because when the majority like the product, it is easy for the product to trend on the market. Thank you.
Yeah, and my comment was actually going to be very similar in some ways, in that if you have a bad product, it's going to affect demand. And the interesting thing is not just demand for that product, but demand for any other future products, because people aren't just thinking about the reputation of this one product, they're learning about the reputation of insurance as well. So one of the things in terms of how we talk about it that we're thinking about is making it an important question about how we all have that common stake. For insurance companies too, it perhaps might be less obvious or less well incentivized in the long term, but thinking about how if you sell a bad quality product that, you know, is wildly ineffective and has some kind of disaster in the field, you're losing a market. So some of it is also thinking about the role of quality in terms of how there's a shared stake in the eventual outcomes, and thinking about that in the long term for a company, and trying to move the discussion towards that long-term company and sector investment, rather than just kind of the immediate, as Jen said, like backing off after a year and saying, this is going to be a bad year, I'm not going to be here. Well, what does that mean for the next 20 years of potential market building, et cetera?
Okay, I have this down. Okay. Just quickly reading what we got in the chat.
Good morning, colleagues.
Yes, please.
Yes, good morning. Sandra from Grenada, part of the Caribbean. Yes, I heard the comments of the speaker before about, you know, the demand for products and so on. And I note that we are speaking specifically and that was Shaylee Wright. And we're talking about insurance, and I do share the reservations that she has expressed, especially if, because, and I noticed in the conversation, we're speaking specifically about insurance and insurance companies, because for the vulnerable and marginalized, we need something flexible that is able to give them the protection that is required in the event that there is an extreme event, but also enables them to make some progress nonetheless. So for example, yes, if this year we paid, but we didn't get money or there is no event, we probably will start thinking about what we could have done with that money otherwise. There is also an issue in our discussions at the national level where payouts are triggered, there is a trigger event. And while some folks, depending on where they are, will share in the payout, even though under ordinary insurance, there will be no payouts. And there will also be persons who get payouts, but do not get the amount that is required. So they get according to what they, what unit they have paid for, how much they buy, etc. In our concept of insurance, I mean, while you may be insured, if you live in a certain part and you were not impacted at that level, which that triggers the payout you don't get, somebody who is more devastated, that will be taken into concern. That will be taken into account. So therefore, how do we put in all of these things together? Because for persons with little capital, it is a big decision to make. And how yesterday we spoke about a bundle, and someone spoke about saving schemes that you can access if there is a health emergency or something like that. So I am very worried, I admit, when I hear us talking specifically and we stick into the issue of insurance and insurance companies. I am not convinced that that is what will provide the solutions that our target requires. And for us in the Caribbean also, there is the issue of numbers. So that is one of the constraints that we have.
Yeah, thank you for these perspectives. I mean, maybe taking up on it, and this will be my last question, I think, on quality. So we focus very much on quality of insurance, specifically household level. But how does it look like with some other of the disaster risk financing instruments? So around, for example, concessional loans, around savings. Are there any quality dimensions that should be highlighted and where there are also evidence gaps around them? Okay, if there are no further views, then I think I probably would move on, if that's okay. So then the next one would be on resilience. So maybe just to give you a quick perspective first before we start the discussion. So from MCI, we also looked at the resilience, and for quite some time actually, specifically if we are talking about climate risk insurance, because at the end of the day, this is kind of the objective. And there are different resilience frameworks that have received some momentum in the literature, but also political momentum. For example, the brace concept around anticipative, absorptive, and adaptive capacities, so different capacities. But there are also others. So the first thing is maybe as a question is also how relevant for your field of work do you actually see the resilience framework? Also in order to organize the evidence. And then secondly, we can go into some of the specifics. Just to give you an additional input, we did a paper, I think around 2 years ago, where we actually summarized also the state of the literature on climate risk insurance and insurance specifically, and resilience. And what we found is that individual resilience capacities, there's a growing body of evidence showing, for example, positive effects on, for example, fertilizer use, things like that. And you can also you can put that to different resilience capacities. There are also forms of negative impacts of interventions, so that you actually have maladaptive effects. So the literature does say this at the same time, so I'm mentioning this. But what we also found is that specifically on the intervention level, it is missing so these kind of studies and also the evaluations, they were only done from a one-dimensional perspective, and they never actually used like a broader scope of resilience, and then operationalizing that by looking at different indicators, for example, that speak to the different capacities of resilience. So just as a quick start, so my question would be, what does resilience mean to you, and how do you also see this relevant in terms of the evidence roadmap? What should be some of the academic efforts moving forward to looking into the resilience space? Yes, please, Lance.
Okay. So based on some literature that I have looked at, resilience can be understood as a capacity, the capacity of a particular system to be able to withstand certain shocks and stressors from climate extremes and disasters. There was a work done in 2015 by Bahadur et al. And he looked at resilience through a 3 A's framework, adaptation, adaptive capacity, anticipatory capacity, and absorptive capacity. I think it is a good way to look at it. It was able to dissect the different elements of resilience and take various different variables to supplement what would be described as the absorptive capacity, the adaptive capacity, etc. So it was very practical, and it was based on the BRACE project, and the main aim of it was to compare different areas based on the resilience. So that is where I think resilience is, and I think that's a good way of understanding resilience.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. So is this a useful, and I'm posing this question, and is this a useful framework for you? Are there also experiences from your perspectives in operationalizing, for example, the BRACE concept? Any brave person moving forward? Jen, be prepared. I know that your PhD is on resilience, so you certainly have things to say to the group, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that when Zunka and I were preparing for today's session, we were wondering whether the concept of resilience is useful is because I think that a lot of the motivation behind the use of the concept in the political realm specifically was this realization that development programming, development assistance, the gains that had been seen with those types of programs and with those investments by governments, by donors, were often erased when there was a shock, and a recognition that shocks, natural hazards, and vulnerabilities and exposures weren't being adequately brought into development programming in a way that would help households, individuals, communities manage risk in a way where these development investments were maintained and hopefully allowed people to escape poverty traps, etc. And I love that theory. It's really, really appealing. At the same time, you know, it is a very donor-centered perspective. It is one that makes it easy for donors to perhaps say, well, once we've achieved resilience, we no longer have to make these longer-term investments. Kind of makes us not responsible for perhaps climate impacts long-term. And so I guess I was just curious whether people who were working in different contexts viewed building resilience as something that meant anything, whether it was a concept that resonated with people, whether they thought it was a useful framework for thinking about climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, or whether people thought, you know, there are these global structures that mean that there are certain places that are highly exposed, there are certain places that are incredibly low income, there are certain places that have very low access to resources, and as a result of that, you know, it is very hard for people to make sustainable livings and achieve high levels of well-being in those contexts, and the resilience concept isn't going to change that. That's my question.
Okay, provocative statement. Kai, you want to say something?
Yeah, I pretty much like what you just said, Jen. The description that this resilience term is some kind of a donor utopia that donors dream of, and that's maybe also why resilience is this concept is so appealing to policymakers, because it's so easy to claim but so difficult to prove, and even to show causality in the realm of resilience. And more difficult is that climate resilience somehow cannot be designed from the overall concept of resilience that also includes mental resilience or health resilience. And nevertheless, I think the goal still is to build some evidence on how we impact with all these products that are out there and all these efforts. But we should still keep in mind that resilience is more than climate resilience and disaster resilience, and that resilience is not binary. It's not you're in or not. There's a continuum in between, and that's something that maybe for us as a secretariat is a difficult task to explain that then to the donor side. That there won't be a 2025 final evaluation saying that now we are climate resilient. I'm still curious to see all the bits and pieces under the evidence roadmap. All of them feeding into this evaluation of the changes to resilience. And I think the concept that you, Lance and Sönke, outlined of adaptive, absorptive, and anticipatory capacity fits this ambition quite well.
I would just add one other point about the non-binary resilience. I agree with that. I think that there isn't necessarily a tendency, but I worry about the potential for people to say, if someone is not resilient, that's their fault. So it's kind of victim blaming in a way. Like, you know, what is wrong with you that you're not resilient? And if we have to build people's resilience, then that suggests that there was something deficient, you know, so I guess that's another concern I have.
Okay, so also in moving this forward with the evidence roadmap, are there more people that have a view on resilience? Clearly, there have to be more people that have a view on resilience, and also what it means to you from the perspective of, say, a civil society actor, or from the perspective of an implementing agency. Yeah, more people, please. You only
Okay, Sönke, this is Simon. So, I mean, our team, the Crisis and Disaster Risk Finance team of the World Bank, we have our own little approach to it. Let's say resilience approach, and it comprises three different types of resilience. Obviously, the financial resilience, financial instruments themselves, core mandate of ministries of finance mostly, but also two other ones, and that kind of, you know, all mutually reinforce each other. One being social resilience, so, you know, helping households and societies cope with disasters, for example, through shock responsive safety nets. And the last one being physical resilience. So it could be, you know, investments in high quality resilient infrastructure, etc. And so this is the one we use. I think it's, I mean, I'm not really sure how we're now going to use the resilience framework going forward, but my understanding, Sönke, and maybe I'm wrong, is that we use this, try to be as specific as possible, so we can build a roadmap that maybe, like, you know, builds on a very concrete resilience understanding of resilience. And I think it would be very useful to, you know, to come from a, I don't know how to say it, but I think it would be very useful to have a really good theory behind it that's as concrete as possible, that will enable us or give us the building blocks for a roadmap going forward, as we try to measure successes and impacts of disaster risk finance and insurance solutions. So I mean, I'm also against like some hyper theoreticalized approach that in the end is too intellectualized and doesn't really help us. But if it's something that can guide our discussions toward this roadmap, then I'm all for it.
Again, valuable and provocative at the same time, and I do like it. I mean, how I can also see it in the actual document, and we will discuss this more tomorrow, but it's also that we indicate some sort of convergence of the use of some of the resilience concepts in the context of looking at impact of the of CDRFI instruments. And so your perspectives and your experience, I think, is really a helpful one, and also to say it needs to be concrete. My view was that also with the brace concept, the appeal was that it is actually also possible to operationalize it, and that everyone can operationalize it for themselves. So this is also an important aspect. So okay, any additional people moving forward? Maybe I take another. I hope I'll get another 2 or 3 before I can wrap up. Okay, that doesn't seem to be the case. Then I would basically, okay, so maybe there are also some questions. Catherine, you want to say something? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's just important to emphasize in any discussion about resilience this concept of intersectionality, because I think it's been touched on but hasn't been articulated. And certainly when it comes to discussions around gender and vulnerability and resilience, recognizing your ethnicity, whether you have a disability, your socioeconomic background, and also even whether you're rurally based or urban based, can affect elements around your vulnerability and therefore your resilience. So that's one aspect I wanted to just flag. And the other thing, which I haven't heard mentioned, but I do think it's worth taking into account when we look both at evidence that exists that provides contextual factors around at least gender differences in vulnerability and resilience is around the legal context. And the World Bank, with their Women, Business and the Law, has this amazing resource which I always speak very highly of, because I use it all the time, where it shows gender differences in the legal context that women face, which influences their economic empowerment primarily, but generally their empowerment. And that has a real bearing on some of their aspects around their resilience at a time of a disaster, both building up and their resilience in preparation for one, assuming they're in a disaster-prone context, but also in how they're able to rebuild their lives and have access to resources beyond that, and participate in the economy. So don't forget that aspect and the relationship between that and the success of CDRFI financing mechanisms sort of in this in these gender differential contexts, because we just take that for granted and it's not always the same.
Superb. Yes. So I mean, also one comment, and also it triggered a thought. So a comment was that we should also look at other kind of objectives beyond resilience, for example, the development impact, so to say, and well-being impacts of these instruments moving forward. I also would say it depends on your definition of resilience. So many of the well-being indicators that can also be considered an adaptation indicator, for example. But there are overlaps, and there might also be some impacts that we are not capturing through the resilience lens. And I think you're right. We have to look beyond just, like, say, the immediate impact of a payout, for example. That's one thing. The other thing, I just wanted to reel back one statement that also Svenja Sominski did in the beginning, that especially when we are talking about resilience impact, it's not only about the objective side of resilience, it's also subjective. So I think this is something which we should highlight moving forward. If people are empowered to be more resilient, if they feel more resilient, then I think that's already also a big impact. And also in terms of the frame of this is something which we should take on board. Okay, if there are no other thoughts at this point, and again, you can also, I mean, on the social media tweets that we made available, you can add additional thoughts, and we will definitely also have, this is only the start in a way to structure the discussion. We will have a chance to for further inputs. But if there are no additional inputs, then I would basically just quickly say on what to expect on the last day. So tomorrow we actually want to look at the document itself to the extent we can do it. So the expectations really on, say, this kind of paper which comes out of this workshop, and also the process afterwards. And so we will present a proposal on how this work can be further structured as part of the Insurance Global Partnership Impact Working Group. And that's one thing. And we will collect expectations on this. Also, if this is kind of, I mean, one can consider this as a call for action on evidence and CDRFI. And so if there are advocates that really want to see one certain field reflected, then this would be your time to make sure it gets, or to make your case that it gets into the document. What we also want to achieve tomorrow is that we look at the different groups. We realized that we had academics at the meeting, but we also had non-academic people. And I think all of them have a role to play in moving forward the topic of evidence, and should view and should kind of phrase their views. So what we want to do is to have a discussion on this, so that we can also at the end have like specific calls for different groups as part of this document. With that, I would say thank you to everyone. And I hope to see you again tomorrow, and also additional people. We will have people moving in and out. That's fine. This is, I think, the nature of the event. But yes, thank you everyone, especially Catherine for your intervention and preparing the talk, and Jen for everything as well. So see you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.